Hi everyone, this is Dr. Raquel Butler from Integrated Veterinary Therapeutics.
And Sophie Vandenberg from Equine Postulate. And we welcome you to the Equine Functional Posture Podcast, your ultimate source for insights into the influence of functional posture on biomechanics, health, and overall well-being of horses.
Whether you're a seasoned equestrian, an equine professional, or simply a horse enthusiast, this podcast is designed to help you understand the critical aspects of functional posture.
Tune in each week as we discuss practical tips, delve into expert interviews, and explore the latest research in the impact of functional posture on equine anatomy, physiology, movement, and more.
Let's create a world where we empower our horses to be in a mental, emotional, and physical balance. Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode. We're talking about the hunter's bump, which is often what it's commonly known as, but it's basically when the top of the pelvis looks really pointy. So how are you going today, Sophie?
Going really well. We decided to do this episode after talking about some horses that you'd seen great transformations with the comfort of their hunter's bump that was a little bit dysfunctional. So it's led into this, and we've got some really good points to share with everyone.
Yeah, it's another, there's lots of common things that we've really talked about throughout this whole podcast, but it's an area that, often people are not sure what to do about, and it can be a difficult one from a veterinary perspective because apart from injecting the sacroiliac joint, there's not much else that vets can do. And I haven't seen as much success as we would like to see with that. Yes, it takes away the pain, but it doesn't necessarily improve the function. And I think if that's a path that people have gone down, it's not wrong, but it needs to be done with a rehab program in mind and working with someone who's experienced with that. And I think the rehab program itself has a lot of value. And the sacroiliac joint is just one small aspect of the complex that creates a hunter's bump.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty, well, first of all, what is it?
Exactly. So a hunter's bump is, what you're actually seeing is the top of the sacral tuberosities. So the sacral tuberosities, even though they say, so you've got the pelvis, which is called the ilium, and then you have the spine, which goes from lumbar, which becomes the sacrum, which runs. So you have the sacroiliac joint, and that's where the pelvis joins onto the spine. And then you have the caudal vertebra, which become the tail. So the sacral tuberosities, even though it says sacrum, are actually part of the pelvis. They're these dorsal projections of the pelvis that sit on each side of the sacral spines of the sacrum. So what happens is the sacrum actually runs underneath the pelvis, and it comes from underneath.
Within, isn't it?
Within, yeah. The base of it runs on the underside of the pelvis, and then the dorsal projections, the dorsal spinous processes of the sacrum scoop up, and they sit between those two projections of the pelvis up on either side. So when you see a hunter's bump, you're looking at the top of those sacral tuberosities on either side of the sacrum. And so when they become pronounced, sometimes it's a little bit of an asymmetrical pronunciation, or they look very close together or wide. It just means that you often have changes in that space, often to the sacroiliac ligaments, which we're going to talk about the anatomy and what they're there for. And sometimes it can be quite painful for the horse, which is one reason we're talking about it today. But it's also a symptom, often, like you were just saying, of a big issue.
Yeah, and it can be for many reasons. So it's not just one aspect of that. So often people will say, oh, the horse has a sacroiliac problem when they see that, and then you can go in and squeeze them, which is called a provocation test. And yep, the horse has pain in there. But, like everything, I don't see it as one simple cause or effect, and that often it's a whole horse. It's a whole horse thing.
Yeah.
Like everything that happens generally affects the entire horse, and sometimes that is the primary area that is creating a primary problem, and sometimes it's secondary to other things like, maybe they have some kissing spine, or maybe they have really not optimal hoof angles that have led to strain through the pelvis, or perhaps they've had long-term saddle fit challenges, or they just lack core strength, and that's put a lot of strain through the pelvis. So, we can go, like, we have a hunter's bump now, but it's like, okay, why did that hunter's bump occur to this horse? And not every horse is going to be treated in the same way, even though they might be presenting, with the same kind of picture. So the sacroiliac ligaments are pretty complex. And we have ligaments that are joining the sacrum to the pelvis above the sacrum and below the sacrum. We can access some of those ligaments directly, like the dorsal sacroiliac ligaments that sit along the top of those sacral tuberosities. And majority of horses have damage in those, like they'll have holes in them, lumps in them, tightness, and we can inject the sacroiliac joint, but if those ligaments are not comfortable or functional, then it's going to affect the way the whole spine works, and definitely the way the pelvis works. So that's one aspect that we can physically palpate. And the other ligaments that we can physically palpate are the sacrotuberous ligaments, which are just beside the anus under the tail at like we say like 10 and 2 o'clock. And they also have muscles attaching to them, like the semitendinosus. And so you can palpate those ligaments in there, and if a horse is very tight in them, they generally will scoot their bum away from you, like they don't want you to put your hand in there, but then once you soften them, they're like, oh my God, it's the best thing in the world. Yeah. So we can palpate them in there for damage and tightness, and the ones on the top, which gives us a bit of an insight into what's going on inside. What about like muscle attachments, to the pelvis?
So you've got the pelvis runs all the way from your, kind of in a big circle. It goes all the way around the pelvic shape. You've got on both sides your tubercocces, the point of the hip. You've got the tuber issues, which are your point of buttock on either side of the tail. Through all of that space, you've got the adductors, which are the medial hind limb muscles. They bring the leg towards the midline. You've got your gluteals on top of the rump, your abdominals, which are, you see them between the last ribs and the tubercocci, and also underneath the belly. You've got your tensor fasciae latae, a pelvis to stifle area muscle. You've also got your hamstrings that run down the back of the legs. And so you have this complex where the pelvis is under the influence of a lot of muscles pulling in all kinds of different directions. So it creates a very stable unit. And so sometimes we see instability through the pelvis, and you'll also see a hunter's bump. And sometimes you see a hunter's bump and a pelvis that is incredibly jammed up, that there's not very much motion left. So like you're saying, there's just so many ways that it, times that a hunter's bump can show up with different kinds of pelvic issues. But yeah, there's just a huge amount of muscles coming through that space. And the soft tissue determines alignment. When you have tension in one area, sometimes you have a change in muscle balance in all of those groups of muscles. It'll change the alignment of the pelvis, which is a change in posture. And it's also a representation. When you're seeing a hunter's bump, the alignment of those sacral tuberosities against the spine, you're seeing an alignment change in that space.
Yeah, and sometimes the pain in that area can be from different things. So, for example, sometimes those sacral tuberosities are sitting so close to the sacrum that they're actually rubbing on the sacrum, and so you're getting pain from that perspective. Sometimes, the lumbosacral joint is sitting in there too, and it's a complex joint of 5 joints, as well as there's a lot of other ligaments supporting across there, like ventral ligaments and dorsal ligaments and intertransverse, and we have the supraspinous ligament coming across the top into those dorsal sacroiliac ligaments too. And so there's a lot of structures that when we just say it's a sacroiliac issue, the sacroiliac joint's within the pelvis. It's a joint that doesn't have a lot of movement. It can definitely get ligament damage. However, I would say it's rare, if ever, that sacroiliac joint has a problem without anything else going on in that pelvis. So when we think about just the complexity of the joint structures in the lumbosacral pelvis, then like you said, all those different muscle attachments coming in from all different directions that are influencing the motion, stability, position of the pelvis, then we can understand the complexity of that area. And I believe that all of those areas need to be looked at and addressed when we're rehabbing, a horse that has a prominent hunter's bump. We need to consider all of those. And often these horses, like you talked about, the muscles that are attaching from the different perspectives, but what you'll often see is weak glutes, so weak rump muscles, especially, they can drop away like as it goes towards the tail, so they kind of drop away. Then you can see floppy glutes, which is the area just at the back of the abdominals, like between the stifle and the pelvis. They can be really floppy, and then prominent.
Sorry, you just said glutes again. So that's the
quads.
Yeah,
Quads.
Quad muscles. Yeah, they can be very floppy. Yeah, just above the stifle or hollow.
Yep, hollow, floppy, or you can see like a really pronounced line of the tensor fascia latae, and then really big prominent hamstrings with what people call a poverty line, but it's like a line down the hamstrings that, I guess historically people would say, oh, they're working their hamstrings, but in a really well balanced horse, you shouldn't see any muscle lines. Like it's all the muscles just flow into each other, and the bones are well covered, like the pelvis is well covered. You can't see the top of the pelvis. And the lumbar area also is well covered. So often we'll see weak lumbar muscling, or sometimes brace, weak glutes on top. So just a lack of glutes. Sometimes they're tight and weak. Sometimes they're bunched and contracted at the top and then they drop away, like in your quarter horses, we often see that. And then weak floppy quads, pronounced hamstrings, sacropelvic dysfunction.
Yeah. And I think it's important to say that sacropelvic dysfunction, because a lot of those muscles.
Lumbosacropelvic dysfunction is probably.
Yeah, lumbosac. And just to also, you said you see that really, it's almost right above the point of the hip. You see this very big gluteal muscle, and right in front of it in the lumbar, it's often really quite weak. And often, sometimes it's very tight in the abdominals, just between the rib cage and the tubercoccyx, and sometimes there's a really big hollow there. Like they're quite sucked in, and when you put your hand in and touch them, they're kind of like, it's like pushing into your tight shoulder. They don't have any big breathing motion. So yeah, it's a whole space dysfunction.
Yeah, there's lots of causes of this kind of dysfunction. I think if you own a thoroughbred off the track, you will have dysfunction in the lumbosacropelvic area. It's just for the explosive starts that they do from the barriers, and often, it's at a very young age when the pelvis is still growing until, often 5 or 6, sometimes older, depending on the horse. And so you've got explosive motion on an area that's still growing. And so that has a big impact on the health of that area, as well as you often have poor hoof balance, again, which can be a product of galloping. It's not necessarily just blaming the farriers, but just they're a product of their environment as well. So they're not moving a heap. they're doing a lot of galloping, which puts different forces through the hooves, different compressive and concussive forces through the digital cushion, for example, at the back of the hoof. And so if you've got an off-the-track thoroughbred, you basically need to be rehabbing the lumbosacropelvic area to create the most optimal performance horse. So that's one area. What other things can cause issues in the lumbosacropelvic area?
Pelvic injury. So that can be one, traumatic. So there's we know that some racehorses can sustain pelvic fractures because of the forces traveling through their pelvis and the concussive forces. I myself,
A drop in performance.
say that again, sorry.
Sometimes they can have a pelvic fracture with a minimal drop in performance.
Yes, and yeah, and I know you've seen that in dissection too, horses that they never really understood behavior issues. They've got a historical pelvic fracture. I myself have had a horse who capped their hip on a telephone pole in the paddock and developed very lumpy sacroiliac ligaments because of it, even though the hunter's bump wasn't super distinct. And so that became a big sacropelvic lumbar dysfunction. I also know a second horse, so another traumatic injury you can have is a fall. Horses who run in the paddock, they prop. If the ground's a bit wet or they're turning a corner and their hind legs slip out from underneath them and go sideways, that's a really big torsion to have through your lumbar and your pelvis. Another one that I know of.
A big torsion, but also a big compression if they hit the ground on their side.
Yes.
And potentially a lot of force that's being shunted through the pelvis from that direction as well.
Exactly. I know one case of a young horse I'd been doing body work with before they'd even been ridden, and they had quite a nice pelvis, and they had a slip during some wet weather kicking around in a yard where their back leg slipped out behind them, and the vet suspected a psoas injury or some kind of muscular injury up in that area, and she developed a hunter's bump in the next 3 to 4 months. So that was
probably ligament damage.
Yeah, up in that space. So, slipping legs out behind in the paddock. And I don't think we're really so much going into prevention in this one, but just as a reminder to people that having good posture is protective for this kind of stuff. Having good proprioception and good core and abdominal control. It's not, it's not like you are guaranteed a prevention, but you're in your best possible position that your horse won't slip and have injuries like that.
Yeah, definitely. And some other causes, like we've done a podcast with Emma Loftus on pullbacks, and that's a big cause of lumbosacropelvic damage. And it only takes one pullback, unfortunately, to create damage through that area. And riding with a weak core. So again, this is the benefit of developing your horse's core and going back to that episode on developing horse's core in the podcast. But if they've got a weak core, it puts excessive pressure through that lumbosacropelvic area. And so there's a lot of strain, and it just predisposes them to further problems. Ellie, when she came to me at 18 months old, she'd had a fall. Well, she'd had two things that we know of happen. One was she ran into a wire, and so just that sudden stop, it damaged like her nuchal ligament. And she'd fallen in the water trough, probably just being curious and mucking around. And so when she came, her pelvis was different. It was uneven on both sides. And she couldn't stand square behind. So at 18 months old, with not being started, no work, there was already an imbalance through her body. And I've also seen her fall over at least once or twice, and just coming around the corner, slippery, and she's just landed on her side. I've seen Mooney do that, just slip on some hay and get up and was really sore through his pelvis for weeks after that. So I've witnessed those things happening in the moment. and then the consequences of those afterwards. So it's
Definitely.
really common, very common. Not like most horses that I see have some degree of lumbosacral. Like I would nearly go to say 100% of horses that I see have some degree of lumbosacropelvic dysfunction or damage.
Yeah. And
Not
in
all of
saying that, yeah,
them.
in saying that, and obviously you've seen what's happened with your own horses at home and observing them, what are these signs that you would say, stand out or that are the indicators for this particular dysfunction?
Yeah, I think shifting their weight a lot in their hind limbs can be one. And yeah, often they will stand kind of camped under, so their legs underneath their body, or really narrow with their hind legs, so their hind legs really close together. They can become quite stumbly behind and lack coordination, so they can look neurological, but it's their lumbosacropelvic area. They can have difficulties with canter and transitions. Like Jelly has chronic kind of lumbosacral pelvic issues and his downward transitions, and he'll hop a little bit coming down from the canter, and he used to not be able to maintain a normal canter for more than a few strides before he'd change behind. They can also be pretty uncomfortable and difficult to ride in the canter. Like maybe they feel like a steam train or they feel like they're proppy behind. And for me, when Jelly's not good, it hurts my back. It's yeah, like, I have a bad back anyway, but my back is really sore when he's not good. Um, yeah, what else would you say?
Probably what you can feel and see around the actual sacrotuberosities and their connection to the sacrum. So having a feel up there, often you'll sweep your hand, it's over the croup, basically, it's often called. Like as you sweep your hand over, you'll feel the hardness of the sacral tuberosity. I've only seen it maybe once. I know you've seen it a bit more swelling around that space. You can sort of run your hand down the side of the sacrum quite intentionally with your finger and see, is there lumpiness? Is there bumpiness? Do I see, so what was that?
Tension?
Tension, yeah. And what do the muscles that are beside the sacrum and sacral tuberosities, what do they feel like? Is there like areas like we talked about that are really jellyish and then a bit that's really hard and it goes back to jelly? Sometimes on one side, I know yesterday I saw a horse, we were working with his sacropelvic area, and one side it looked like his sacral tuberosities were higher on one side, but his muscle development was actually just a little bit less on one side. So you'll see all these small things when you look closely, and having a feel through there and just seeing, is the space in between my sacral tuberosities really narrow? Is it really big? What does it feel like for the horse? And what reaction does my horse give me? Because they're very body aware when you are listening to them. Do they turn around and look at me, or do they get tense in the eye as I put my hand through that area?
Yeah, and for a bit of a gauge, ideally you'd like, obviously it depends how wide your fingers are, but like about 2 finger widths between the sacral tuberosities, and that you can squeeze across them and they're not obviously like painful, or that you don't drop them through doing that. I think another sign which we didn't say was difficulty picking up their back legs, like for the farrier or the trimmer, or kicking. I mean, there can be other causes of as well, like physically, but these horses will find it quite difficult to pick up their back legs for any length of time. And yeah, I've seen some where they've had acute injuries and the swelling over that area is really, really prominent. And they're really restricted and sore through that connection of the lumbosacral area.
Definitely. And what kind of, we're talking about sacropelvic and lumbar dysfunction in a whole space, but obviously all of those structures are connected to other parts of the body, and you also talked about the fact that this can be a primary and a secondary issue, because we've talked about traumatic injuries and also it being postural and alignment issue. What are the compensatory relationships that commonly pop up for a hunter's bump?
I think often the horses that I've seen diagnosed with proximal suspensory desmitis in their hindlings, when I look at their pelvis, I'm like, interesting, because often the pelvic posture is a bit crap. And so their use of their core would not be optimal. And so, of course, the suspensory comes under strain, and then they can't get the suspensories right because the problem is up high. And so whenever you've got that showing up, I would say look up and look at that lumbosacropelvic area and the hoof balance, of course, because there's a relationship with negative plantar angles. So if you look at your coronet band of your horse when they're standing on a flat surface, preferably square, and if you look at the angle of the coronet band and you draw a line, it should bisect between the around the area of the carpus and not too much higher. If it's going up through the elbow or the belly, then you've got an issue with your hoof balance. And so as you're addressing the lumbosacropelvic strength, you need to address the hoof balance to help with that. So they go really hand in hand. Like it'll make the lumbosacropelvic area worse. And sometimes, that dysfunction is created by the feet, but also if they've got a lumbosacropelvic issue, it'll make the feet the way that they're loading as well. So I always think you have to address both in that rehab process, not just like the hoof balance can make a massive difference, but I still think you want to then address the pelvic function.
Yeah, definitely. I actually had a really lovely conversation with an awesome trimmer the other day about the fact that the owner, she'd taken on this new pony, and he does have quite low heels, but he also has a very, very pronounced hunter's bump and the classic, weak glutes, tight hammies, in poor core strength. And we all stood and had a discussion about the fact that, these are the exercises that I would suggest post body work and moving forward for core strength. And, what she was going to do to try and support that from the feet up, and then see, what can the owner do working top down and hoof up. So, it's not really a one directional thing when you have two areas that are struggling.
No, it really helps to encompass both, and then, encompass that comfort aspect as well, because getting them comfortable, teaching them how to use their core is going to be integral. And then the other thing, like it can be linked to kissing spine, just maybe primarily or secondary, depending what the inciting causes of that were. Like if they've had kind of chronic poor saddle fit, it changes the angles and stresses through the pelvis, especially, if they've been jumping and landing with that, it's going to create a lot of stress. And I mean, I think jumping horses in general, it can put a lot of stress through their lumbosacropelvic area, depending on their hoof balance, their saddle fit, the way they're ridden. And we do see quite a lot of eventers with a prominent hunter's bump. And ideally, we would have them having great glutes because then that would mean they've got a really good pushing power for jumping, as opposed to a prominent hunter's bump. So repetitive strain injuries, I think, are quite common through the pelvis. And then that puts a lot of strain on the hocks too. So we get hock arthritis relating to that too.
Definitely. And let's talk about solutions. Obviously, it's a whole space, and that also means sometimes that finding that if your horse has one particular issue, just wanted to say compensatory relationships also often find that you have like some kind of hamstring tension that also includes having not an overly distinct fibritic myopathies, but which is when horses have, scar tissue in their hamstrings and they kind of slap their hinds down, but they can have stringiness, particularly over the tuber issue, so the point of buttock, because it's a lever point for the hamstrings, and we often see a very pointy bum at the same time as a hunter's bum.
Tissue there.
Definitely. And so when you have that kind of happening, often if that is an area, if this is secondary because of hamstring issues, you want to be treating, your hamstring tears, etc. So as an example, when you say what can you do to help it, part of it is figuring out, is there, try and find some improvement, and is there something that possibly is giving us is being a bit of a limiting factor in how the pelvis moves and what we can do to help it. What is something that you could start with or give somebody recommendations for?
I think there's probably I was going to try and break it down to 3, but I mean, if you had to choose one thing, just doing carrot mobilizations, nose to toe, so with the head coming between the front legs, going towards the ground first and then staying below the carpus, below the knees, is just a really nice, lengthening exercise that's going to create mobility through the spine and stretch into that lumbosacral area. So I think that one's a great place to start. The other thing is just massaging the glutes and hamstrings a bit. So with your hands, like, in equinology, we do like shampooing and raking those areas. And there's a really good hamstring walk on the equinology website to kind of help with that. Some owners, I'll get little hand massages to massage their horses in those areas. You've just got to not go over the bone with those. But yeah, giving those areas a bit of a massage to create circulation through those muscles and get them working. And then you want to activate the right muscles. So probably the easiest one is a side-to-side activation with either your hand on the sacral tuberosities or on the tail. They have to be comfortable enough in those areas. But just creating a gentle weight shift from one side to the other, and looking for the quads to actually contract without the clunk of if you hear a clunk, sometimes it can be the kneecap or the patella losing alignment because it's not being well supported through the quads. And so and that's just showing up weakness. But you're trying to kind of build that stability without that occurring. So side-to-side activations, and I would say doing at least 10, a couple of sets of 10 before you ride can be really beneficial, and then nose to toes and beyond after you ride. So massage first, then activations, and then nose to toes beyond after you ride. They'd be my 3 things. What about you?
Number 1 would be addressing what we said, the hoof balance. So looking at your coronet MPA, that's your hoof pastern alignment, and it's best if you always have a look. The best tip I can give people is to have a look from the ground level, because when you look from the side and you evaluate the coronet band, you're not getting an accurate representation. So you want to have a look from the ground. I often show people you just take a picture from the side. If you get the horse to stand on even, level, flat ground, and then go to the side and take a picture from the ground level and have a look at so it's drawing a line from the coronet band at the back of the foot to the coronet band at the, the very front of the foot. And if you draw a line through that and then continue it to the front legs, where does it cross the front leg? Is it the knee, or is it coming higher to, between the knee and the elbow up to the elbow or into the belly?
And we want it around the carpus, yeah.
Around the carpus, yeah. So your other one would be promoting a balanced stance. So that is often helped along with variable feeding positions. We have an episode on that, number 8. And that in particular allows you to encourage the horse to basically stand on their hind legs in an engaged fashion. So you just want to see that the horse loads them nicely, that they're not pushing back on their hamstrings, that you have a little bit of belly bounce, and that they're square. You have even steps between them. And if you can't, you've got an even loading between them and that they're square behind. And if you can't get that, bodywork for the pelvis and pelvic ligaments and the whole sacropelvic and lumbar area. Body workers will target the whole space. It's also important, just what we talked about, the connection between compensation and relationships, to see that you don't over release some areas and not others. So sometimes, a lot of work around the hip will allow the hip to move better. But if the back has also been very tight or the core can't engage, the horse feels comfort in the hip and will overuse the motion that's now available and quite comfortable. But the back tension releasing at the same time creates a better posture overall, because all of those features are connected, all the structures are connected. So yeah, body work that's quite holistic for the sacropelvic lumbar area would be my third suggestion.
Yeah, and we were talking before the podcast about the complexity of working on the pelvis versus, say, the thoracic sling. And the complexity with the pelvis is it has so many attachments in so many different directions. And whenever I'm working to balance the pelvis up, it's like I said before, the sacroiliac joint's a very small part of it, but it's working on the structure. So the bony attachments like lumbosacral joint, sacroiliac joint, hip joint. And then it's working on the muscular attachments. So checking those, like you said, the hamstrings, adductors, glutes, like, do I have any issues with the attachment points specifically? And then the next area is the health of the ligaments and how they, like the tension, the pull, any kind of fascial pull through the ligaments. And then the other area is the iliopsoas, I think, is a massive contributor to pelvic function. So we've got like the joints, the ligament attachments, the muscle attachments, and the iliopsoas are, kind of specific areas that will really hold the pelvis in a position. And so it's like at the start when I said we can't just inject the sacroiliac joints, like I'm checking probably 10 or 15 things, and that's just in the hind end. Then I'm going back and balancing it to the rest of the body at the end of a session. But just for lumbosacropelvic function, there's many aspects that I'm looking at to enable and check that function. And the more isolated we get, the more we miss pieces of the puzzle. I think, like you said, releasing the hip and then not addressing the spine, the more we can bring the body into a whole balance, even if it's not perfect yet, the more we can just work with that whole body, piece by piece, bring it into balance is, just so valuable. And then creating that through appropriate movement and use of the core is just integral. And sometimes it's really simple exercises that I have the owners doing after those sessions, but I often am amazed at the differences they can create in their horses once I've just gradually instilling that function back in there.
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like we actually touched on quite a few things in this episode. Main takeaways, I think probably, are that changes in the sacropelvic ligament and alignment are incredibly common. You're seeing them in, essentially every horse in some form, a little bit of dysfunction. They can be painful, sometimes not not always, but they don't have to be painful to be dysfunctional, and it's a symptom of an issue through the whole space. What would you say other takeaways are for today?
Yeah, that there can be a lot of different causes, so it can be ligament damage, it can be like lumbosacral restrictions, it can be hoof balance, it can be iliopsoas injuries. And so just because you see a hunter's bump, you don't just go, it's this. Because yeah, there can be a lot of contributors to that. So I think for each individual horse, keeping that in mind and not just going, oh, my horse has a hunter's bump. And there's a lot of things that you can do. Just remembering that riding will put more stress through the pelvis, especially they're unlikely to have a well-functioning core if they have a hunter's bump. Like it's just not possible, right? If the pelvis is not able to move appropriately, the core can't engage the pelvis. And so optimally you would build that function before hopping back on them. So you'd make sure that, yep, I can get really lovely smooth pelvic rounding. I can get a really lovely, and we didn't really talk about these, but I can get, these are kind of measures for good function. I can get really nice pelvic rounding that's smooth and comfortable. I can get really nice belly lift that's smooth and comfortable. I can get a base of the neck lift that's smooth and comfortable and the whole body can connect in that. Then you've got a horse that you can consider loading through riding. But if you don't have the function in those areas, the chances are that they're going to, compensate to take up the load. And so, like I've said in other podcasts, really good riders can help them through that with really good saddle fit. And, when everything is good, you can help them. But the majority of us, myself included, don't have enough control and balance in our bodies to help the horse as much as what we can, and help them find that within themselves. So we're not holding them in that position.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we could go on about this all day, but
We'll have to, I think, other parts of the sacropelvic area, probably doing a zoom in and doing episodes on those too, and they'll almost have relationships to one another. You can come at them from so many angles.
yeah, 100%. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you for joining myself, Dr. Raquel Butler and Sophie Vandenberg in today's podcast. Enjoy your horse time. Please subscribe to the Equine Functional Posture podcast so you don't miss our weekly episodes, and give us a 5-star rating so we can share more valuable insights.
And we will see you in the next exciting episode.